The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink when a knock came at the door. The woman living in the small house on the edge of town wasn't expecting anyone. She wiped her hands on her apron, curious about who could be visiting so late in the evening. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. Standing there was a man who looked like he'd been through hell. His clothes were torn and covered in dirt, as if he'd been walking for miles without rest. His boots were scuffed and worn down, barely holding together anymore. A cowboy hat sat low on his head, shading most of his face, but his piercing blue eyes peeked out from underneath it. He had a scruffy beard that made him look rugged, almost wild. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something oddly familiar about him, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Ma'am," he said in a deep, gravelly voice, tipping his hat slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been traveling for days, and I lost my horse in a storm last night. Do you think you might have room for one more tonight? Just a place to sleep and maybe something to eat?" She hesitated for a moment. Letting strangers into your home always carried risks, especially someone who looked like they'd stepped straight out of the wilderness. But then again, this was a quiet little town where people still helped each other when times got tough. Plus, there was something in his tone, something genuine that made her feel like turning him away would be wrong. "Come in," she finally said, stepping aside. "You look like you've had a rough time of it." He nodded gratefully and stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered. Up close, she noticed how tired he seemed. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Still, there was an air of strength about him, like he'd endured far worse than losing a horse in a storm. She pointed him toward the kitchen table and told him to sit while she heated up some soup. As she stirred the pot on the stove, she glanced over at him. He was looking around the room, taking in the simple furnishings, the wooden chairs, the faded curtains, the old clock ticking steadily on the wall. It was clear he wasn't used to such humble surroundings. "So," she began, trying to break the silence. "Where are you headed?" He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Nowhere special, just moving along." His answer was vague, almost evasive, but before she could ask anything else, he added, "What about you? You live here alone?" She nodded, stirring the soup a little faster now. "Yeah, just me in this old house. It's peaceful, though. Quiet." He gave her a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was sadness there, buried beneath layers of weariness. She wondered what kind of life he'd led before showing up at her doorstep. Was he running from something or someone? When the soup was ready, she ladled it into bowls and set one in front of him. He thanked her quietly and began eating, savoring every bite as if it were the first real meal he'd had in days. Watching him, she felt a pang of sympathy. Whoever he was, whatever he'd done, he clearly needed help right now. After finishing his food, he leaned back in his chair again, looking more relaxed than before. They talked a little more, mostly about the weather and the land around them. He mentioned working on cattle ranches and riding trails across Texas, but whenever she asked for specifics, like where exactly he'd worked or how long he'd been traveling, he changed the subject smoothly, avoiding giving too much away. Despite his evasiveness, she found herself drawn to him. There was something magnetic about the way he carried himself, even in his current state. And those eyes, they kept nagging at her memory, like she'd seen them somewhere before. Later that night, after showing him to the spare bedroom, she settled onto the couch with a cup of tea. Unable to shake the feeling that she knew him from somewhere, she started flipping through some old magazines stacked on the coffee table. Most of them were outdated, filled with stories she'd already read, but one headline caught her attention. "Missing Millionaire declared dead after plane crash." Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the accompanying photo. It showed a well-dressed man standing next to a private jet, smiling confidently for the camera. Beneath the fancy suit and clean-shaven face, though, were unmistakable features. The same sharp jawline, the same intense blue eyes. Her hands trembled as she held the magazine closer, reading the article again. According to the story, Benham Richards III, the heir to a massive oil fortune, had disappeared months ago after his plane went down near the Wyoming-Montana border. No wreckage had ever been found, and authorities eventually declared him dead. But what if they were wrong? What if the man sleeping in her spare bedroom wasn't just some wandering cowboy, but the missing millionaire himself? She sat there for a long time staring at the picture, her mind racing. Could it really be him? If so, why was he pretending to be someone else? And what should she do about it? Eventually, she set the magazine aside and tried to calm herself down. Whatever the truth was, she'd find out soon enough. For now, all she could do was wait and hope she hadn't made a terrible mistake by letting him stay. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the small house with warmth. The woman woke up early, her mind still buzzing from the discovery she'd made the night before. She couldn't stop thinking about the magazine article and the photo of the missing millionaire. It was hard to believe that the man sleeping in her spare room could be the same person, but the resemblance was undeniable. She tiptoed down the hallway and peeked into the guest room. He was still asleep, sprawled out on the bed with his hat resting on the floor beside him. His face looked softer in sleep, less guarded than it had been the night before. For a moment she felt guilty for doubting him. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe he really was just a lost cowboy looking for shelter. But deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore what she'd seen. When he finally woke up, she greeted him with a warm smile, trying to act as normal as possible. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "I made some coffee. Want a cup?" He nodded, rubbing his eyes and sitting up slowly. "That sounds great. Thanks." As they sat together at the kitchen table, sipping their coffee, she decided to test the waters. She brought up recent news stories casually, mentioning how strange it was when people went missing without a trace. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Like that millionaire who disappeared a few months ago. Remember hearing about that? They said his plane crashed somewhere near Wyoming." His reaction was subtle but telling. At first he froze, his hand tightening around the coffee mug. Then after a brief pause, he forced a shrug and muttered, "Yeah, I heard about that. Tragic stuff." His voice sounded calm enough, but there was something off about the way he avoided meeting her gaze. She pressed on gently, watching him closely. "It's weird though, isn't it? How no one ever found anything, not even pieces of the plane. Makes you wonder if maybe he survived." For a split second, his mask slipped, revealing a flicker of unease. But just as quickly he recovered, giving her a tight-lipped smile. Maybe, or maybe he didn't want to be found. With that, he stood up abruptly, muttering something about needing some fresh air. She let him go, pretending not to notice how tense he'd become. Once he was outside, she exhaled deeply, her suspicions growing stronger. There was no denying it now. He was hiding something big. And if her hunch was right, he wasn't just any drifter passing through town. Later, that afternoon, while he was busy chopping wood in the backyard, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. She typed Benham Richards III into the search bar and hit enter. Page after page of articles popped up, detailing his life before he vanished. As she scrolled through them, a clearer picture began to emerge. Benham Richards wasn't just rich, he was filthy rich. His family owned one of the largest oil companies in the country, worth billions. From a young age, he'd been groomed to take over the business, attending elite schools and mingling with powerful people. But despite his wealth and privilege, he'd always seemed unhappy. Interviews and photos showed glimpses of a man trapped in a gilded cage, desperate to escape the expectations placed upon him. One article caught her attention in particular. It talked about his strained relationship with his father, a stern and domineering man who reportedly controlled every aspect of Benham's life. Friends and colleagues described Benham as restless and disillusioned, often talking about leaving it all behind. Some even speculated that he might have orchestrated his own disappearance to break free from the pressure. Her heart sank as she read those words. If this man truly was Benham Richards, then his arrival at her doorstep wasn't just coincidence. It was a cry for help. Whatever he'd been running from, it must have been suffocating enough to make him abandon everything he'd ever known. By the time he came back inside, sweaty and covered in sawdust, she'd made up her mind. She needed answers. not just for her own peace of mind, but because she cared about him. Whether he realized it or not, he radiated vulnerability beneath his tough exterior. She couldn't turn her back on that. "Hey," she said softly as he washed his hands at the sink. "Can we talk for a minute?" He glanced over his shoulder, frowning slightly. "Sure. What's up?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Last night I did some reading about that millionaire who went missing. And, well, I couldn't help noticing how much you look like him." His entire body stiffened, and for a moment, she thought he might walk out again. Instead, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," she replied, holding up her phone so he could see the photo, "that I think you're him. Am I right?" The silence that followed was deafening. He stared at the screen, his jaw clenched tightly. She could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he weighed his options. Finally, he sighed heavily and sank into a chair, running a hand through his messy hair. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "My name is Benham Richards. But please, don't tell anyone yet." Relief washed over her, mixed with a tinge of sadness. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" she asked. "You can trust me, you know." He chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "Trust doesn't come easy for me these days. Not after everything I've been through." Over the next hour, he opened up to her, sharing bits and pieces of his story. He explained how the plane crash hadn't been an accident. It had been staged. For years, he'd felt trapped by his father's demands and the relentless spotlight of fame. The crash gave him the chance to disappear and start over, to live a life free from expectations. At first, freedom had felt exhilarating. He traveled across the country, working odd jobs and living off the land. But as time passed, loneliness crept in. He missed human connection, missed having someone to share his thoughts with. That's why, when he showed up at her door, he hadn't expected kindness or recognition. Listening to him, she felt a surge of empathy. It was clear he wasn't just running away from his old life. He was searching for something real, something meaningful, and somehow fate had led him to her doorstep. The days that followed felt different, charged with a quiet tension. The woman and the man, Benham as she now knew him, fell into an unspoken rhythm. He helped around the house, chopping firewood, fixing the squeaky gate, and even attempting to mend the leaky roof. She cooked meals, tidied up, and watched him closely, trying to reconcile the rugged cowboy in front of her with the polished millionaire from the magazine photos. Despite his confession, he remained guarded, sharing only fragments of his past, when prompted. He spoke about growing up in a world where money solved problems but created others, where every move was scrutinized, and where freedom felt like a distant dream. Yet there were moments when his walls cracked, revealing glimpses of vulnerability. Once, while they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, he admitted, "I never realized how lonely my old life was until I lost it." She nodded, understanding, more than he might have expected. "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what really matters," she said softly. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. But for all the progress they made, questions lingered. What would happen next? Could he truly stay hidden forever? Or would the weight of his old life eventually catch up with him? These thoughts swirled in her mind constantly, gnawing at her resolve to keep his secret. One evening, as they sat together in the dim glow of the living room lamp, she broached the subject again. "You can't run forever," she said gently, breaking the silence. "Eventually, you'll have to decide what comes next." He looked at her, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. "I know," he replied after a long pause, "but I don't know if I'm ready to face it yet." "What are you afraid of?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Your father? The media? Losing the freedom you've found?" "All of it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Out here, I'm nobody. Just another drifter passing through. But out there," he gestured vaguely toward the window, as if the Rest of the world lay just beyond the glass. Out there, I'm Benham Richards III, heir to an empire I never wanted. People see me as a symbol, not a person. How do I go back to that? She considered his words carefully before responding. Maybe you don't have to go back to that version of your life. Maybe you can create something new, something that works for you. Her suggestion seemed to spark something in him. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked hopeful. What if I could take control of the company, instead of letting it control me? What if I used my resources to make a difference, to build something better? It's possible, she encouraged, but you'll have to confront your father sooner or later. You can't rebuild without addressing the foundation. He sighed, rubbing his temples. You're right. It's just not going to be easy. No, one said it would be, she said with a small smile. But you're not alone. Not anymore. Her words seemed to lift some of the weight off his shoulders. Over the next few days, they began making plans. They scoured news articles and financial reports, piecing together information about the state of the Richards empire. She helped him draft emails to trusted allies, lawyers, accountants, and former employees who might still be loyal to him. Slowly but surely, he started taking steps toward reclaiming his life. Still, the outside world loomed large, reminding them both of the risks involved. Reporters occasionally drove through Willow Creek, asking locals if they'd seen anyone matching Benham's description. Each visit sent a jolt of anxiety through her, though Benham tried to reassure her. They won't find me here, he said confidently, not unless someone tells them. But confidence didn't erase fear. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the kitchen and found him sitting at the table, staring blankly at a cup of cold coffee. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. You okay? She asked, pulling out a chair beside him. He shook his head. I keep thinking about what happens if they do find me. What if they drag me back to that life kicking and screaming? What if I lose this us? His words caught her off guard. She hadn't realized how much their bond meant to him, or how deeply he feared losing it. Reaching out, she placed a hand over his. We'll figure it out together, she promised. No matter what happens, we'll face it side by side. Her reassurance seemed to calm him, at least for the moment. They spent the rest of the night talking about the future, about what they hoped to achieve and the challenges they might face along the way. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, they had a plan. The following morning, they loaded up her truck with supplies and essentials. Benham insisted on leaving behind most of his belongings, saying he didn't need reminders of his old life weighing him down. As they pulled away from the house, she glanced at him, noting the mix of determination and apprehension on his face. You ready for this? She asked. He took a deep breath, then nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. And with that, they set off toward the unknown, leaving behind the safety of Willow Creek for the chaos of the world beyond. Whatever lay ahead, they faced it together, bound by trust and a shared desire to rewrite the story of Benham Richards, not as a runaway heir, but as a man determined to forge his own path. The journey back to civilization was long and filled with moments of quiet reflection. The woman drove while Benham sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the endless stretch of open road. Every so often, he'd glance at her as if reassuring himself that she was still there. She could tell he was nervous. His fingers tapped restlessly on his knee, and his jaw tightened whenever they passed a gas station or diner where people might recognize him. They stopped once to refuel and grab some snacks. While she pumped gas, he stayed in the truck, pulling his hat low over his face. A couple of travelers walked by, chatting loudly about recent news stories. One of them mentioned the missing Millionaire case, speculating whether Benham Richards III was really dead or just hiding somewhere. He flinched at the sound of his name but forced himself to stay calm. When she returned to the driver's seat, he gave her a weak smile. Still think we can pull this off? He asked, half joking. She nodded firmly. We'll take it one step at a time. You've already come this far. You're stronger than you think. Her words seemed to steady him, at least for the moment. As they got back on the highway, he leaned his head against the window, lost in thought. The closer they got to Dallas, the more reality began to sink in. This wasn't just a trip. It was a leap into uncertainty. For months, he'd lived under the radar, free from expectations and judgment. Now he was walking straight into the lion's den. When they finally reached the city, the change was jarring. After weeks in the peaceful countryside, the noise and chaos of urban life felt overwhelming. Cars honked impatiently, skyscrapers loomed overhead, and billboards flashed advertisements for products no one really needed. Benham stared out the window, taking it all in. It was like stepping into another world, one he hadn't been part of for what felt like a lifetime. Their first stop was a small motel on the outskirts of town. They checked in under fake names, knowing they couldn't risk staying anywhere too public. The room was plain but clean, with 2 twin beds pushed against opposite walls. As soon as they unpacked their bags, Benham pulled out his phone and powered it on for the first time in months. Notifications flooded the screen, missed calls, texts, emails, but he ignored them all, focusing instead on drafting a message to his lawyer. "I need to let him know I'm alive," Benham explained. "But I can't trust anyone else yet. Not until I figure out who's on my side." She watched silently as he typed out a brief email, keeping it vague enough to avoid raising suspicion. Once it was sent, he set the phone down and sighed deeply. Now we wait. Waiting turned out to be harder than either of them expected. Every knock on the door made them jump. Every ring of the phone sent shivers down their spines. To pass the time, they talked endlessly, about everything and nothing. She learned more about his childhood, growing up in a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. He shared stories about school friends who only cared about his money and business associates who saw him as a pawn in their games. In return, she opened up about her own struggles, the loneliness of living in a small town and the dreams she'd put on hold. One evening, as they sat together watching an old movie on the motel TV, she turned to him and said, "Do you ever wonder if things would have been different if you'd stood up to your dad sooner, like before the plane crash?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Yeah, sometimes I do. But I didn't know how back then. I was scared. Scared of failing. Scared of disappointing him. Scared of losing everything I thought mattered. It took hitting rock bottom for me to realize none of it was worth it. And now?" she asked softly. "Now I have something worth fighting for," he replied, meeting her gaze. His words hung in the air between them, unspoken promises lingering beneath the surface. 2 days later, the lawyer responded. He agreed to meet them in person at a secluded cafe downtown. When they arrived, Benham spotted him immediately, a tall, gray-haired man in a tailored suit sipping coffee at a corner table. The lawyer's eyes widened in shock as Benham approached, but he quickly recovered, standing up to shake his client's hand. "Mr. Richards," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We thought you were gone." "I was," Benham replied evenly. "But I'm back now, and I need your help." Over the next hour, they discussed the state of the Richards empire. The lawyer explained that Benham's father had taken over daily operations after the presumed death, tightening his grip on the company and alienating key stakeholders. Morale among employees was low and profits were beginning to dip. Meanwhile, rumors of Benham's disappearance had fueled speculation about internal power struggles, damaging the family's reputation. Benham listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little. When the lawyer finished speaking, he leaned forward and said, "I want to fix this, not just for me, but for everyone who depends on the company. But I can't do it alone. I'll need your support." The lawyer hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. Finally, he nodded. "If you're serious about this, I'll do whatever I can to help. But your father won't make it easy." "I know," Benham said grimly. "That's why I need to be smart about this. No grand entrances, no dramatic announcements. We play it cool until we're ready to act." As they left the cafe, the weight of the task ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. Yet, he also felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could turn things around. Back at the motel, she found him pacing the room, deep in thought. "What's going through your mind?" she asked gently. "I keep thinking about my dad," he admitted. "How angry he's going to be when he finds out I'm alive. How betrayed he'll feel." "You're not doing this to hurt him," she reminded him. "You're doing it because you deserve a life that makes you happy. That's not selfish, it's brave." Her words brought tears to his eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. "Thank you," he whispered, "for believing in me, for sticking by me." She smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Always." And with that, they prepared for the next phase of their journey, facing the past, confronting the present, and building a future neither of them could have imagined when they first met. The confrontation with his father was inevitable, and Benham knew it. For days he had been preparing himself mentally, rehearsing what he would say and how he would say it. But no amount of preparation could dull the knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach as they drove toward the Richards family estate, a sprawling mansion surrounded by manicured lawns and towering iron gates. The woman beside him glanced over, sensing his unease. "You don't have to do this alone," she reminded him softly. "Whatever happens in there, remember why you're doing it." He nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "I know, but that doesn't make it any easier." When they arrived, the sight of the mansion hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of everything he'd tried to escape. The grand columns, the glittering chandeliers, the endless rooms filled with expensive furniture, all of it felt suffocating now. As they stepped out of the car, a valet approached, but Benham waved him off, handing her the keys instead. "Let's go," he said firmly, leading the way inside. The moment they entered, all eyes turned to them. Staff members froze mid-task, their expressions shifting from shock to disbelief. One older maid gasped audibly, clutching her chest. "Is that Mr. Benham?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could react further, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the foyer. His father appeared at the top of the staircase, dressed in a sharp suit, his presence commanding as always. At first, he looked confused, then furious. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked, descending the stairs with calculated precision. "Who let you in?" "It's good to see you too, Dad," Benham replied dryly, though his tone betrayed the tension simmering beneath the surface. His father stopped a few feet away, his piercing gaze sweeping over Benham and then resting on the woman standing quietly beside him. "Explain yourself," he demanded, his voice icy. "Where have you been? Do you have any idea what your disappearance has done to this family? To the company?" Benham took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. "I needed to get away. From you. From the pressure. From the life you forced me into. I couldn't breathe anymore, Dad. You never listened. You only cared about control." For a moment, his father looked genuinely stunned. Then, anger flared in his eyes. "Control? Is that what you think this is about? I built this empire so you could inherit something worth having, and you threw it all away." "No," Benham shot back, his voice rising. "You built it for yourself. You wanted me to carry on your legacy, not mine. Well, guess what? I'm done living for you. I'm here because I want to take back my life, and maybe even fix some of the damage we've caused along the way." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. His father stared at him, searching for signs of weakness, but Benham stood tall, unflinching. Finally, the older man sighed, sinking onto a nearby chair. "So what do you propose to do now?" he asked, his tone grudgingly softer. "I'm taking over the company," Benham declared, "but on my terms. No more exploiting resources or cutting corners. We're going to focus on sustainability, innovation, and treating our employees like human beings, not numbers. If you can't accept that, then fine. I'll find a way to make it happen without you." His father studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, he chuckled bitterly. "You really are serious, aren't you?" "Yes," Benham said firmly. "Dead serious." After the initial shock wore, off negotiations began. With the help of his lawyer, Benham laid out a detailed plan for restructuring the company. He proposed shifting investments toward renewable energy projects, improving working conditions, and giving employees a greater voice in decision-making processes. His father resisted at first, arguing that such changes would cost too much and alienate shareholders. But Benham remained steadfast, presenting data and case studies to prove his points. Throughout the process, the woman stayed by his side, offering quiet support whenever he needed it. She attended meetings, helped draft proposals, and reminded him to take breaks when the stress became overwhelming. Slowly but surely, progress was made. Some board members were skeptical, but others saw the potential in Benham's vision. By the end of the week, a tentative agreement was reached. Benham would assume leadership of the company under strict oversight, with quarterly reviews to ensure profitability didn't suffer. As the dust settled, Benham found himself reflecting on how far he'd come. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, setbacks, and people who doubted him. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Hopeful about the future, hopeful about his ability to create change, and hopeful about the bond he'd formed with the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. One evening, after another long day of meetings, they sat together on the balcony overlooking the city skyline. The lights twinkled below, a sea of possibilities stretching out before them. "What happens now?" she asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We start building," he replied, wrapping an arm around her. "A better company, a better life. Together." She smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. Two ordinary people determined to leave their mark on an extraordinary world. Months had passed since Benham took over the reins of the Richards empire, and the transformation was already visible. The company's boardroom, once a place of tension and conflict, now buzzed with energy and collaboration. Employees who had once felt like cogs in a machine were beginning to see themselves as part of something meaningful. New initiatives like sustainable energy projects and community outreach programs were gaining momentum, earning praise from both shareholders and the public. But for Benham, the real change wasn't in the numbers or headlines. It was in how he felt about himself. For the first time in his life, he woke up every morning with purpose. He no longer dreaded the day ahead or felt trapped by expectations. Instead, he embraced each challenge as an opportunity to grow, not just as a businessman, but as a person. The woman who had stood by him through it all noticed the shift too. Gone was the restless drifter who had shown up at her door months ago. In his place was a man full of determination and hope, a man who finally seemed comfortable in his own skin. She often caught herself smiling when she saw him interacting with employees or presenting new ideas to the board. It was clear that he wasn't just rebuilding a company, he was rediscovering who he was meant to be. Despite the progress, there were still moments of doubt. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting, Benham slumped into a chair in his office, looking exhausted. "Do you think we're doing enough?" he asked, rubbing his temples. "Sometimes it feels like we're fighting against a tide that never stops coming." She sat down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're not going to fix everything overnight," she said gently, "and you don't have to. What matters is that you're trying. That's more than most people can say." Her words struck a chord. He nodded slowly, letting them sink in. "You're right. I guess I just need to remind myself why I started this in the first place." "Why did you start it?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. He thought for a moment before answering. "Because I wanted to prove, to myself, to my dad, to everyone, that I'm not just some spoiled heir, that I can make a difference, and because—" He paused, glancing at her. "Because I realized that happiness doesn't come from money or power. It comes from living authentically, from being surrounded by people who care about you and caring about them back." Her eyes softened and she smiled. "That's a good reason." As the weeks turned into months, they found ways to balance work and life. Though Benham's role as CEO kept him busy, He made time for the simple joys they discovered together during their days in the countryside. On weekends, they escaped the city, driving out to quiet places where they could breathe fresh air and forget about deadlines and meetings. They explored small towns, hiked through forests, and spent hours talking about their dreams for the future. One weekend, while sitting by a campfire under a sky full of stars, Benham looked at her and said, "I've been thinking about us." Her heart skipped a beat. "What about us?" "I want to build something permanent," he continued, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "Not just with the company, but with you. You've been my anchor through all of this, the one thing keeping me grounded when everything else felt chaotic. I don't know what I'd do without you." Tears welled up in her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. "You'll never have to find out," she replied softly. "I'm not going anywhere." They sat there for a long time, holding hands and watching the flames dance in the darkness. Neither of them needed to say anything more. They both knew they had found something rare and precious, a partnership built on trust, respect, and love. Back in the city, life continued to evolve. The Richards name, once associated with greed and excess, was slowly becoming synonymous with innovation and compassion. News outlets praised Benham's leadership style, highlighting his focus on sustainability and employee well-being. Critics began to soften their stance, acknowledging that he might actually be the breath of fresh air the industry needed. Even Benham's relationship with his father improved, albeit gradually. While the older man still struggled to let go of control, he couldn't deny the positive impact his son's changes were having on the company. Over time, their conversations shifted from arguments to discussions, and occasionally, even laughter. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for Benham, that was enough. Years later, when they looked back on their journey, they marveled at how far they'd come. From a chance encounter on a dusty porch to reshaping an entire empire, theirs was a story of resilience, courage, and second chances. Together, they proved that even in a world driven by wealth and status, true fulfillment came from staying true to oneself and finding someone who believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself. As they stood on the porch of their ranch, one they'd purchased together outside the city, they watched the sunset paint the horizon in hues of golden crimson. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers, and the distant sound of cattle lowing filled the air. It was peaceful, simple, and exactly what they had dreamed of. "You know," Benham said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, "I used to think running away was the only way to escape my problems, but now I realize sometimes the best way forward is to face them head-on, with the right person by your side." She leaned into him, smiling. "Here's to facing whatever comes next, together." And, with that, they stepped inside, ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing they'd already found their happily ever after.